On April 26, 1999, police arrived at the Fulham home of Jill Dando and there found the lifeless body of the golden girl of British TV outside her front door, a single bullet wound to her head, the keys to her BMW convertible still in her hand. The inquiry into her murder conducted by the Metropolitan Police would be the largest criminal investigation since the hunt for the Yorkshire Ripper. A prime suspect, Barry George, had a history of stalking women, sexual offenses, and other antisocial behavior. George was arrested and convicted at the Old Bailey for Dando's murder, receiving a sentence of life imprisonment. Following an appeal and retrial, he was acquitted. Some believe George guilty of Dando's murder, while others suspected her work on Crime Watch was a direct result of her murder by a contract killer, or even the retaliation for the UK's involvement with NATO's bombings committed in Serbia. Despite these theories, the senseless killing has continued to remain unsolved.
A much respected and admired television personality, Jill Dando began her career a trainee reporter for the local weekly newspaper, the Western Mercury, where both her father and brother worked. After 5 years as a print journalist, she started to work for the BBC, becoming a newsreader for BBC Radio Devon in 1985. That year, she transferred to BBC Southwest, where she began presenting a regional news magazine program, Spotlight Southwest, and 2 years later she worked for Television Southwest, then BBC Spotlight in Plymouth. By early 1988, Dando had moved from regional to national television in London to present BBC television news, specifically the short on the hour bulletins that aired on both BBC One and BBC Two from 1986 until the mid-1990s. During the early 1990s, Dando presented various BBC television programs, including Breakfast Time, Breakfast News, the BBC 1 o'clock news, the 6 o'clock news, and the travel program Holiday. From 1996 until her death, she was co-host of the crime appeal series Crime Watch alongside presenter Nick Ross. In December 1997, Dando met gynecologist Alan Farthing on a blind date, set up by a mutual friend. At the time, Farthing was separated from his wife, and by January 1999, several months after Farthing's divorce was finalized, the couple announced their engagement at a party attended by Sir Cliff Richard, Nick Ross, and Anna Ford, with the first interview being secured by OK Magazine. Their wedding was set to take place on September 25, 1999. On the morning of April 26, 1999, Dando left Farthing's home in Chiswick and returned alone, by car, to the house she owned in Fulham. She had previously resided in the house, but by April 1999, was in the process of selling it and rarely visited the property. As she approached her door at about 11:32 a.m., a man grabbed her from behind, forced her to the ground, and shot her in the head with a 9mm caliber semi-automatic pistol. 14 minutes later, her body was found by neighbor Helen Doble, who called police. When detectives and paramedics arrived on the scene at 11:47, Dando was taken to the nearby Charing Cross Hospital, where she was declared dead on arrival at 1:03 p.m. The killing of the talented and much-loved presenter had shocked the nation. The Metropolitan Police launched a murder inquiry, Operation Oxbow, one of the largest criminal investigations the force had conducted since the manhunt for the Yorkshire Ripper. It would eventually involve the taking of 2,400 statements, the tracing of 1,200 cars, and the investigation of 2,000 potential suspects. The moments preceding and the aftermath of the murder were investigated by police as witnesses came forward with information. It was learned that at 10:03 a.m., a postman delivering mail to Dando's house in Fulham noticed he was being watched by a dark-haired man in a suit. At roughly the same time, a traffic warden patrolling the area spotted a blue Range Rover parked illegally. She began to write a ticket, but stopped when the driver protested. Over the next hour, the man in the suit and Range Rover driver were seen by several different people. At 11:30 a.m., Dando is shot as she walked to her front door. Two witnesses reported seeing a man with thick dark hair and wearing a wax jacket running away from the house. Several minutes later, CCTV images recovered by police show a blue Range Rover traveling at high speed down Fulham Palace Road, away from the scene of the murder. A man is then spotted, at around 11:40 a.m., crouching by some railings in a nearby park, furtively talking on a mobile phone. Another witness reported that some 10 minutes later, they were forced to brake hard when a man ran across the road, away from Dando's street. During the early stages of the investigation, much of the attention, particularly in the media, focused on the men who had been romantically linked to Ms. Dando, which might offer an explanation for her cold-blooded murder. Dando had lived with television producer Bob Wheaton, 14 years her senior, before their relationship ended, according to some accounts, because he tired of her frequent absences as she traveled the world on assignment for the holiday program. Then there was a young South African game warden named Simon Basil, with whom Ms. Dando had enjoyed what she described as a very lady chatterly relationship. Eventually, on a blind date, she met gynecologist Alan Farthing, who she described as the man I love. However, there had been briefer flings between these three publicized romances, as police discovered when they started trawling through Ms. Dando's personal diaries. During the early stages of the investigation, Detective Chief Inspector Hamish Campbell, who was leading the murder hunt, was quoted as saying, "Her career must be looked at, but I do not consider it to be of equal importance to her private life. We have many positive leads, but once these leads were thoroughly investigated, they turned up nothing, and all the men whom Ms. Dando had romances with were cleared." The murder investigation would uncover the kinds of sordid stories concerning a celebrity's love life that provided many newspaper headlines, such as the story about an allegedly besotted Russian crime lord who had been the subject of speculation that he had ordered Ms. Dando's killing because she had rejected his advances while filming for the holiday program in Cyprus. One potential lead had been given the day after the murder, which referred to a mentally unstable man who lived just 500 yards from Ms. Dando's home. Yet it would take detectives some 10 months before they came to seriously consider this man as a suspect. The possible explanation for such a delay was that those detectives who were investigating the murder of one of the BBC's most popular stars would naturally encounter an increase in media coverage, which produced an avalanche of tips and suggestions, only a fraction of which were useful. When detectives finally did begin to look into Barry George, they were surprised how much he started to fit the psychological profile provided in May 1999 by forensic criminal psychologist Dr. Adrian West, who had urged police to look for an obsessive loner. George had previous convictions for attempted rape and indecent assault. On one occasion in the early 1980s, he was found hiding in the bushes at Kensington Palace, wearing khaki, carrying a knife, a length of rope, and a poem he had written to Prince Charles. Investigators soon learned he was a fantasist who had falsely claimed to be named Barry Bulsara, the cousin of Queen singer Freddie Mercury. In May 1980, he appeared in court dressed in glam rock clothing and falsely gave his name as Paul Gadd, the singer better known as Gary Glitter, who was later exposed as a pedophile. He claimed his occupation was unemployed musician, and he said he was the former managing director of a company that oversaw 3 rock bands. He had previously applied and failed to join the Metropolitan Police in 1980, and thereafter posed as a policeman, having obtained false warrant cards, for which he was arrested and prosecuted. George had some experience with firearms, and spent nearly a year in the Territorial Army, being taught how to maintain and shoot assault rifles and machine guns, before being discharged in November 1982. He had been arrested in both April 1990 and January 1992, and charged with assault. However, neither case progressed to court. Many women came forward and complained that he had stalked them, and when police searched his flat, they found many photographs of local women, and no fewer than 4 copies of the Jill Dando memorial issue of the BBC's in-house magazine Ariel. During the search, an overcoat belonging to Barry George was taken as evidence. Inside the pocket, a forensic scientist found a tiny particle, which he said could be firearms residue from the gun used to kill Jill Dando. Now convinced they had their man, police interviewed witnesses who could place Mr. George near Ms. Dando's house on the day of the murder. He was also placed under surveillance and later arrested on May 25, 2000. When questioned, George told them repeated lies about his whereabouts that day. But with evidence such as the firearms reside, they believed they had ample proof of his guilt. He was charged on May 29, 2000, and put on trial at the Old Bailey, where he was convicted by a majority of 10-1, handed a life sentence on July 2, 2001, and jailed. Many thought the case solved. However, there were some who believed the evidence was not sufficient to warrant his arrest and conviction. A subsequent appeal in July 2002, which addressed a number of different factors, such as witness testimony, scientific evidence, and the role of the trial judge, found that the verdict of the jury was not unsafe, and the appeal was dismissed. In December 2002, the House of Lords refused to allow George permission to take his appeal to a higher court. It wasn't until some 4 years later, on March 25, 2006, that his solicitor claimed to have new evidence that would undermine the safety of George's conviction. The following year, on June 20, 2007, George won the right to a new appeal after the Criminal Cases Review Commission found that too much weight had been placed on such a small amount of forensic evidence at the trial. His conviction was quashed on November 15th, and a retrial is ordered after the Court of Appeals decision. At his preliminary hearing, George pleaded not guilty on December 14, 2007. The main point of contention against his conviction was the single particle of gunshot residue found in the coat pocket, which his defense argued could not be deemed conclusive proof that he had committed the crime. That evidence could have been the result of contamination when the coat was placed on a mannequin to be photographed as police evidence. Similarly, the validity of psychiatric reports and witness evidence had been called into question. One witness alleged to have seen him in Dando's street some 4.5 hours before her murder, while others claimed they saw him in the street 2 hours before, but failed to pick George out of an identity parade. His second trial began on June 9, 2008, and garnered a great deal of media attention because of the high-profile nature of the case. The case of the prosecution differed greatly from the first trial, in that there was practically no scientific evidence relating to the gunshot residue, which had been ruled inadmissible by the trial judge, Mr. Justice Griffith Williams. The court had been told by expert forensic science witnesses that it was no more likely that the particle had come from a gun fired by Mr. George than that it had come from another source. Much of the evidence centered on the bad character of George, which had been explored at length during the first trial. It became known in April 2010 that the Ministry of Justice had denied a claim of $1.4 million in compensation made by George in relation to his wrongful imprisonment for Jill Dando's murder. By August, it was ruled by the High Court that George would be entitled to a judicial review of the claim. When the Supreme Court defined miscarriage of justice as evidence, George's solicitor requested that then Justice Secretary Ken Clark reconsider George's claim for compensation. However, in 2013, the High Court ruled against him and refused to compensate any money for his erroneous conviction and the years he spent behind bars, because the law states that compensation should only be paid when a new fact emerges to prove beyond reasonable doubt that an applicant did not commit the offense. During an interview with the Daily Mail, he said, "How can you be acquitted unanimously by judge and jury, which means you regain innocent status, but then get told you are not innocent enough?" He has, however, fared better in winning damages from various tabloid newspapers over the many salacious allegations published about him. In December 2009, he accepted an undisclosed amount from Rupert Murdoch's News Group newspapers over articles published in The Sun and the News of the World. Further damages were awarded by the Mirror Group newspapers concerning claims unrelated to the Dando investigation, that George had developed an obsession with singer Cheryl and newsreader Kay Burley. With the release of Barry George and the overturning of his conviction, the question remains, who was responsible for her brutal murder in April 1999? There have been several theories surrounding the circumstances of what has been considered by many to be a professional assassination by a contract killer. Perhaps the most enduring theory behind Ms. Dando's death is that she was brutally murdered by a Serbian crime gang as retaliation for her coverage of the Serb-Kosovo War. Just 20 days before she was killed, she had fronted a BBC Kosovo crisis appeal that raised more than £1 million in 24 hours for refugees fleeing the violence. At the time, Western involvement, which included NATO bombing of key Serb targets, had begun, with British forces carrying out strikes in Belgrade just days before Ms. Dando's murder. It later emerged that the day after Ms. Dando was killed, the BBC's former head of news, Tony Hall, was phoned by a man with an Eastern European accent who threatened, "Your Prime Minister Blair butchered innocent young people. We butcher back." While this theory prevailed on the front sheets of newspapers for months, subsequent investigations have cast doubt on the possibility, with the call to Mr. Hall believed to be a hoax. A number of high-profile journalists had remained in Belgrade during the war, including veteran BBC correspondent John Simpson, who would have been a much more obvious target for Serbian warlords. One of the most common theories around Ms. Dando's death is that she was murdered by a professional hitman in revenge for her work as a Crimwatch presenter. During the police investigation, detectives discounted up to 30 people who had reason to resent the crime program, while convicted contract killers were visited in prison for information. In 2015, former Surrey police detective and TV investigative journalist Mark Williams Thomas suggested that Ms. Dando had been murdered on the orders of a London underworld Mr. Big to send out a direct, bloody message to others. Do not take unorganized crime. After trolling through 52,000 documents made available to Mr. George's defense team during his second trial, Mr. Williams Thomas said he had found an intelligence report naming two London men as having acted for a major organized crime gang. One of the men was never traced, while the other was found with no clear evidence of his involvement in the criminal underworld. It was also noted that while Ms. Dando's murder had the hallmarks of a professional assassin, there was an obvious contradiction as the killer had left the shell casing at the scene, indicating a more amateur attacker. Other lines of inquiry included the possibility that a deranged fan was responsible, or that Ms. Dando was the victim of a mistaken identity. The latter was judged unlikely, given that she had been murdered on her own doorstep. Another theory that emerged after the Jimmy Savile sexual abuse scandal was that Ms. Dando had been investigating a pedophile ring and the BBC during the 1990s, prompting a revenge attack. The BBC said it had found no such evidence of such a claim.
Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that.